In the early days of video games, driving a real car in your game was unthinkable, even if the car was a 2D pixelated drawing. But in 1994 came Need for Speed. Using real cars, the dream could come true. Today games like Gran Turismo and Forza have hundreds of real cars. But one of the things that many players don't know is how car licensing works. From this, some questions arise, such as, why do many games not bring the newest car models? Because games like GTA or Watch Dogs have fictional cars similar to real ones, or even because the Toyota Supra is not in some games and in others it is? Well, for this last question I already gave the answer in another video, so I'll put the link here in the description. I search about this theme and much of the information comes from articles I researched about licenses. We also have an interview given by Ford people to the Fast Company website on this subject, but there is also an analysis based on what I have observed in the I've been watching racing games for the last 8 years. So now, at the beginning of this video, I'm going to explain how licenses work in a very didactic way, and then I'm going to address some other information about this. Just so we don't get it, let's say I'm a developer and I want to create a racing game. Let's call it Speed Cars Racing, a very generic name, and it's going to be an open-world racing game. One of the things that is already working on development is the budget that will be spent on the entire game. Within this budget there is an amount allocated only to licensing. Developers don't disclose these values, so this can vary according to the size of the game. So to create this situation, I'm going to guess a value. So let's imagine that I have a budget of $500,000 just with the licensing of car models. We must remember that I cannot exceed this value. The first thing I do is get in touch with the car brand licensing team and present my game. I'll explain what it's about and send you a list of cars from that brand that I'm interested in having in the game. Let's imagine that I want these BMW cars for the game Speed Cars Racing. One thing we don't know is if there are models that can't be licensed, but it's possible that they do. There are indications that McLaren Senna became exclusive to Forza games in 2018, only appearing in other games 2 years later, but I cannot confirm this. Returning to my game, BMW will evaluate my list and give me the value for having these cars in the game. I don't know what the amounts are, so let's imagine she asks for $60,000. If I confirm, BMW will give me a contract with several instructions that I must follow and also the complete data of all these models. Later in this video, I explain how these rules work, but they talk about how the car must be deformed, its physics, and even what you can and cannot do with the car. If the amount is too high for my budget, I might decide not to include that tag in my game. This happened with Assetto Corsa, which did not include Aston Martin in its first game due to the high price charged for car licenses. There are also cases where brands want their cars to be in my game as a marketing strategy. In these cases, for example, Ford could even pay for the new 2023 Ford Mustang Mach-E to be in Speed Cars Racing. This we see in the partnerships that Toyota and Genesis have with Gran Turismo 7. Another example of marketing was when a car from Cyberpunk 2077 arrived in Forza Horizon 4. After the details are settled, we know that the contract says how long these cars can be at my game. This is evident when we see that both Project Cars and Project Cars 2, as well as Forza Motorsport 7 and Drive Club had to leave digital stores because their licenses expired. Games can be played, but they can no longer be sold digitally, and the reason is usually this: licenses. Unfortunately, neither the developers nor the brands reveal how long the licenses last, but based on information from these expired games, the approximate license time should be up to 10 years, which can be more or less depending on the brand. Usually these 10 years start counting from the beginning of the agreement and not from the launch of the game. I made an average lifespan of a game and they last around 5 to 7 years if the licenses are not renewed. So the more time I spend developing the Speed Cars Racing game, the less time available I have to use these cars. One thing is very important for us to think about: developing a car for the game is time-consuming and complex. According to Polyphony, each car developed for the game Gran Turismo 5 needed the work of 4,000 man-hours to finish one model. That's why there is a strategy that developers use to save time and also to monetize the game, and that strategy is the DLCs. Remember the list of BMW cars I bought for my game? Not all cars will make it to the game at launch. I will strategically choose some cars that will arrive later in free updates, paid DLCs, or packs. This is a way for me to buy time to release the game early and also earn some money with extra content. This explains why in the monthly updates of Gran Turismo 7, sometimes they bring cars of the same brand in sequence. There were 4 Suzukis between April and June 2022 and 5 different Nissans between July and November. These cars were all licensed together, but were released piece by piece. After I released Speed Cars Racing, I kept working on the game, developing all this unreleased additional content until I had nothing left to bring to the game. It is at this point that the developers begin work on the next game in the franchise. In our case here it will be Speed Cars Racing 2. Normally, the sequel will have all the cars from the first game, plus new cars that I will bring in through license renewals. How does it work? Let's imagine that my contract with BMW is about to expire. Now having a bigger budget for licenses, thinking that my first game made a lot of profit and sold a lot, I renew the cars I already have. With this I keep speed racing cars for sale in stores for a longer time, and I take the opportunity to buy new car licenses, some newer models, some old ones, this according to what the players like. There are situations where I bring new brands, and this is very common. As I said before, Aston Martin did not come to Assetto Corsa, but it is present in Assetto Corsa Competizione. This is due to a higher budget for licenses. When I renew, I often don't renew for all brands at the same time, because some manufacturers' licenses are much longer than others. Something that is very common is that when I renew with manufacturers for the new game, I also bring new cars to the game that are on the market. So while I'm developing Speed Cars Racing 2, Speed Cars Racing 1 gets the cars as well. This happens a lot in Gran Turismo and Forza. Content intended for the new Forza Motorsport 2023 may also appear in Forza Horizon 5 Seasons. Now we have a question to answer. Is there a way to save on the cost of licenses or even not pay for them? The answer is that it is possible. Some developers have some strategies. One of them is not to license directly with the vehicle brand, but with competing companies. For example, you might have a Hoonigan Focus RS RX. This would not be a license directly from Ford, but from the adapting company. In this situation it is Hoonigan. But in some games this can limit you to customize the car and not even touch its paint. Another example is bringing NASCAR, GT3, or even DTM cars to my game. Although we are talking about the Mustang, the Audi RS5 and the BMW M6, the license is not obtained with these brands, but with the competition teams. In some cases they can be much cheaper than licensing the model directly with the manufacturer. There are also alternative versions. We can have in my game an RUF, which is a brand that customizes Porsche cars, instead of having Porsche cars themselves. Another way is to create fictional cars based on real cars. Games like Mafia, GTA, Wreckfest, Watch Dogs and others use this strategy. Instead of paying thousands of dollars in rights and renewals, they choose to create their own cars. This also makes your games last much longer, because if a Forza Horizon 5 has its car license expired, it can no longer be sold. On the other hand, if we look closer, GTA 5 doesn't have this problem. But these types of games, even if they wanted to pay to have real cars, they couldn't, and this has to do with restrictions. One of the biggest problems with licensing is the manufacturer's requirements. When you sign a license agreement, there are a number of requirements and restrictions on what you can and cannot do with the cars. According to Ford marketing director Brian McClary, the concern is how unrealistic a car can be in a game. Ford doesn't want you to take a Ford Focus and go 500 miles per hour at the push of a button. They don't want the player not to find in the real car what he is seeing in the game. For this reason, car manufacturers share all possible data with developers to ensure accuracy and realism. These licenses bring a number of things that should or should not happen to your cars. In Assetto Corsa there is no aftermarket upgraded version of the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34. There is the case of Ferrari not wanting its F50 to appear damaged. That's why we don't see an Aston Martin DB5 losing its bumper in Gran Turismo, which is what would happen in games like Wreckfest. This explains why in some games the collisions are much more subtle and the deformation of the cars is limited to scratches and small dents. There are brands that don't want to see their car all destroyed in the game. See Gran Turismo where the car hits hard, but it just scratches the paint like the car is made of adamantium. For Mark Bentley, Ford's licensing manager, they don't want their brand's cars exploding, overturning for unknown reasons or catching fire out of nowhere. Games that focus on destruction and running over animals and pedestrians are not licensed. This explains why in The Crew 2, people and pedestrians dodge cars like ninjas and why GTA doesn't, and never will, have real cars in its games. Another licensing problem that affects a lot of games is remakes and remasters. We have seen several games being re-released. We have remasters and remakes of many classic games, but when the situation is like racing games everything is more complicated. Then we see Burnout Paradise, which features fictional cars, being re-released on modern consoles, but we don't get any Midnight Club. Even to re-release a game, as happened in Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, all car licenses had to be renewed, and that's a lot of money invested there. There is a high chance these games will die, as it is not possible to find a Forza Horizon 3 or an F1 2017 in digital stores, and the reason is the expired licenses. We only find these games on physical media. The great abyss there is that in the not-so-distant future, when physical discs become obsolete, racing games will have a more forgettable future and will only be in nostalgia. Well, I think this is it. Were you able to understand how licenses work? Tell me in the comments if you already knew about these things or this video expanded your knowledge on the subject. I hope I helped you understand. For more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Bye.